Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be taking a look at the new Larian Mod Toolkit and how to use it to extract game models and textures. So first we're going to have a look at what tools we need to actually be able to do any of this. Then we're going to do a quick introduction to the Mod Toolkit and how to set up a modding and extraction environment. Then we're going to look at some case studies on how to locate and extract models and textures because there's going to be some differing levels of difficulty here. Every model and every material has some of its own particularities. That being said, the extraction process is pretty straightforward for every single one of them. However, recreating those materials in something like Blender is going to be where a lot of those differences lie. So some of the examples that we'll be having a look at here are introductory beginner example is just going to be extracting Ketheric's Warhammer. It's going to be our most straightforward model and texture set. Next, we're going to have a look at extracting this market tarp detail in Shadowheart's camp. This is going to level up our difficulty and complexity because we have an alpha channel here. If you see when I switch to the object view, the sides here are just solid, and so it's an alpha texture that is giving us this little cutout detail. And the coloring on it has a different type of texture map, which we'll have a look at, and that'll be extracted and used a bit differently than some of the other texture sets. And anything with alphas, in just this scene here, you have plants which use the alphas, you have paper, the bedrolls, even the big tent. The net over here is using an alpha channel. So you'll encounter a lot of alpha channels, but there are some particularities that we need to be conscious of when we're extracting maps with alphas. And last but not least here, because I know everyone's going to be interested in it, we're going to have a brief discussion covering extracting character models and their clothing and armor. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on how to actually set up those textures to make them look good in Blender. And that's because it is an extremely involved process. If you have any experience working with textures in Baldur's Gate at all so far, you know that textures are just something else with this game. And because all of the armor and clothing, as well as the characters, are so customizable, the complexity is just going to be worth its own video or even series of videos to cover that topic in the depth that it deserves. That being said, by the end of this tutorial, you'll still be able to extract all of the models and all of the textures in order to be able to do that. So without any further ado, let's get started. Alright, so let's cover what tools and resources we're going to need to be able to do this. So right now we're looking at the intro page for the Larian Mod Toolkit. This seems to also be called glasses, if you see up here. So if you see people referring to it as glasses, that's where that is coming from. For that, you'll need to install it from Steam, and you're going to need to have this have the tools drop down activated in the menu here. Then you're going to need Blender. I'm currently on Blender 4.3.2. I've been doing this through several versions of Blender, and it's been working in all of them. Next, we're going to need this Norbite add-on for Blender. It's going to allow us to both import and export our models. One thing to note about it is it was developed for Blender 3.6. Again, I'm on Blender 4.2 and it's working just fine. It's worked fine through several versions of Blender, but in case it ever breaks, you can always download an old version of Blender to make sure that it runs on that. Next, we're going to need the export tool, also from Norbite here. We need this so that the other add-on works properly. If I go to my preferences here, once we have the import and export add-on installed and enabled, we're going to need to fill out this divine path here So I have the export tool extracted here to a folder. You just go into the packed here, and then you want to point it to the divine.exe. If you don't have this path filled out, you won't be able to import models. It'll just throw you an error and tell you that you need to point it to the divine.exe path. Another thing that we will inevitably need is the older Baldur's Gate 3 Modders Multi-Tool. This tool has been around a lot longer than the official Larian Mod Toolkit, and we're going to need to use it for when the newer Mod Toolkit inevitably doesn't export some of the textures completely correctly. So we'll need to use the old Modders Multi-Tool to get those textures out correctly. Here are some optional tools that you might find helpful. You can download GIMP. It's able to open up and edit DDS files, as well as convert them. On the topic of DDS files, you can use any multitude of tools to batch convert DDS files. I've used this DDS Clobber tool available here. Again, this is optional. You can use any other number of tools that can bulk convert DDS files. This is just what I've happened to be using. And we'll talk about why we might need that once we get to the texturing section. And at the end of the video, we're going to take a quick peek at Volno's texture toolbox. We will not be using it in this video because it is honestly deserving of an entire video on its own, perhaps even a series of videos. For the examples that we'll be looking at today, they're going to be pretty straightforward. We won't need to use a tool like this. But once you get into the more complicated models and materials, you're going to want to use Volno's texture toolbox. Alright, so once you have all of those tools installed, let's see about setting up the mod toolkit. This is what you're going to see when you open up the mod toolkit. You'll see all of your recent projects here and the rest of them down here. So for this, let's go ahead and create a new project. And I'm going to call it Tutorial. Alright, and once it loads after a minute, you'll be presented with a Select Your Level window. For extracting resources, it kind of doesn't matter what level you choose, so I often like to choose some simpler ones, but because this is a beginner's tutorial, let me show you what this is and what this does. So for instance, we have Act 1A Wild here, and I'm going to go ahead and load up Wild Crash Site D and hit select. Because this is a larger level, this might take a minute or two to load, which is why I like to load the smaller levels. Once you're in here, you might realize that you just get a blank blue screen. That's just because the camera is out in the middle of nowhere right now. So I can try to look around here, and there's everything. Another thing that you can do is over in the world outliner here, you can just double click on anything in there and it will zoom you to that object. Now, in order to look around the game window here, you're going to middle mouse click, and that's going to allow you to pan around. To move the camera, you can use WS, A, and D, just like in any game. Q and E will move the camera up and down. So let's move the camera out here. So you can see that we're looking at the crash site once you land off of the nautiloid here. Left clicking will select any of the objects here, and you can see what thing that you have selected in the hierarchy here. You also have like a preview of what you have selected. So this is great for finding resources. Like if there's a certain decoration or like furniture asset, or if you wanted to like extract a scene or something, you can go around and look at what models are being used in the game levels here. If you ever want to switch levels once you are in a mod, you go up to File, Load Level, and let's load one of these smaller ones here. I think Basic Level A is a really quick loading scene, so that's a good one to choose. As another example, I'll just go into the camps here, and towards the bottom we have all of our companion camps. And let's just have a look at Minthara's camp. So this just loads Minthara's personal campsite, and if I zoom in here, we can see that, for example, it looks like her tent is actually made up of 2 different objects, and we can see that it is Army Tent Medium B Top A Kolivar. But yeah, this is how you can explore the game and see what assets are being used. So before we extract anything, there is something that we always need to do in our mod, and that is we need to set a data path. So if you go up into the options and go into preferences, we need to go into the global settings here, and we need to set a source asset data path. Now, because I've already been modding, I have an asset data path already filled in here, but it's for the wrong mod. You can see that it's accessing the Baldur's Gate folder in my program files. It's going into data, mods, but it's using my sandbox mod, which is not the tutorial mod that we just made. If it's your first time in the mod toolkit, this will probably be blank for you. So we're going to go ahead and hit the 3 dots. And then we're going to navigate to our Baldur's Gate 3 install file. This is not to be confused with the Baldur's Gate 3 toolkit. We are using the toolkit. That is not where we need to point it. We need to be in the Baldur's Gate 3. We need to go into data. And here's another potential point of confusion. You'll see all of my mods listed here, like my clothing extractions, decor extractions, and so forth. But then we have another subfolder called mods. Don't go into any of your named mods folders here. You'll want to go into Baldur's Gate 3, data, mods, and then you're going to see the same list of folders again. Why it does it this way, I don't know. But as you extract things, some things get put into these inner folders, other things get put into these outer folders. Again, why it's this way, I don't know. But for this data path that we need to set, we need to go into Baldur's Gate 3, data, mods, and into the mod that you're currently working with. It'll come preloaded with this localization file. We need to create a new folder and call that data. Go ahead and select it. And now our source asset data path is in the right place, and it needs to end in a folder called data. So go ahead and save and close that. You need to do this every time you start a new mod, or anytime you open the toolkit and go to a different mod than what you were working in before. Because as you use the toolkit, this preferences is just set for the toolkit in general. Why it can't just be set per mod, I'm not really sure. But I've definitely had instances where I'm working in one mod, switch over to another mod, I forget to change the source asset data path, I extract a few things, and then I'm like, where the heck did they go? I don't see them in my data folder. And it's because I forgot to change the asset data path, and so it extracted to the wrong mod. So anytime you make a new project or switch to a different project, just make sure you set the source asset data path here. So once we've located a model that we'd like to extract, how do we actually go about doing that? So for instance, let's say we wanted to get Minthara's tent here, and it's Army Tent Medium B. For that, a majority of our work is going to happen in the Resource Manager, which is this like little booklet or something icon up here that says Create and View Resources. So when you click on that, you'll have the Resource Manager tab up here. you can switch back to the game tab here. That'll always be running in the background. But for a lot of resource extraction, you frankly won't even need the game. I'll just load whatever level I feel like and then immediately switch to the resource manager, and all of my work takes place here. So for instance, if we start typing tent medium B, we're going to see all of the assets that have tent medium B in the name. So whenever you click on an asset here, you'll get another preview window up here. This one will always be linked to whatever you're looking at in the game window here. And then this upper one is going to be looking at whatever you're scrolling through in the asset window. Or excuse me, the resource manager. When you're searching through the resource manager, make sure you're clicked on all here. If you're in any of these other subfolders, like for example, you might be in your mod folder, it's not finding anything in my mod because we haven't extracted anything into my mod yet. So if you're ever wondering why your search is not querying anything, you might be clicked into one of these folders here. So I'm going to click back to all. I'm going to backspace a little bit here so that we can see there's several types of resources that have tent medium in here. We have physics resources and visual resources in this case. All of these little buttons up here are filters. So if I hover over here, you can see what type of resource that button is for. If I undo the visual resource, it will get rid of all of those. If I click it again, it'll bring them back. If I right-click this, it will solo only the visual resource. Right-click again, and you can see it brings everything back. So another good thing to know is that the search in here is not case sensitive. So if I do like all caps tent underscore, it'll bring up anything with tent in it regardless of the text case. Also, underscores will be treated the same as spaces. So if I do tent space medium, again, it'll still bring up anything with the underscores. So that's just good to know as you're using the resource manager. All right, so let's get into our first example here. First, we need to figure out how are we even going to find our model. And it's always good to have game screenshots. It can be really helpful to pull up the Baldur's Gate 3 wiki. Sometimes the wiki will have unique identifiers listed here. Sometimes they're just completely wrong though. So for example, this says that it's Mag Ketheric Warhammer. If I go ahead and copy and paste that though, it brings up nothing. It is totally blank. And if I try the universal unique identifier, I get the same thing. So as far as what these unique identifiers are, I really have no idea where some of the wiki pages are getting these, but it doesn't hurt to check. So because Ketheric's hammer isn't just an item that's going to be found floating out and about in any of the levels, what can we do here? We can try to search Ketheric. And so we have a bazillion different resources for Ketheric, but we're after a model, so I'm going to solo the visual resources. And we still have too many, so maybe Ketheric Warhammer. And so it looks like we found something, but when we load it in here, it doesn't look right. This looks like when he's maybe using some sort of ability or something. Also, by the way, this window has the same navigation as the overall game. One navigation I didn't cover is if you right-click and drag, you can zoom in and out here. So that's super useful. And then when we click on this other one, it loads almost nothing. It looks like kind of this energy or sound thing. That's probably just like a special effect that gets rendered on top of whatever. So sometimes you honestly just need to guess and check here. So maybe we search Warhammer. And we can have a look through all of the Warhammers here, and it looks like Warhammer A1 is what we are after. So every asset in the game is going to have its own unique name and its own global unique identifier or universal unique identifier, in case you see GUID or UUID. Whenever I'm extracting something, I like to start a notes document to keep track of all of the different assets that I'll be after. So if I right-click the Warhammer, I'm going to go down to copy name underscore GUID to clipboard. I'm going to go into my notes app, and then I like to just paste that name here. So we have the name here, that is the name, and then underscore, and we have the global unique identifier. So, for instance, if I copy this name into here, we're going to get the same item or any other item that shares the same name. I'm going to go ahead and unsolo the visual resources, so we can see that there's also some material resources and a texture resource, also a physics resource that share this name. However, if I go back to the global unique identifier, copy that, paste that in here, I'm only getting the visual resource, even though I have it available to search all resource types. So that's just good to know. If you're after a very specific type of item and type of resource, and you have the global identifier for it, you can get to the item that way. Sometimes it's nice to search the overall name of the item, because that will bring up your visual resource, which is the mesh, your material resource for it, and even your texture resources. That being said, sometimes there are items which share materials with other items. You might search for an item and not see any materials or textures for it. In that case, it might be sharing a material with a similar item with a slightly different name. But we'll cover how to figure that out later. Alright, so we found our mesh. How do we actually extract it and get it into Blender? Well, for visual resources, you can go ahead and right-click, extract visual data, and it says this will extract weapon human warhammer a1.gr2 will be copied to the source asset path, and that's the source asset path that we pointed the toolkit to in the preferences. It's going to ask you if you want to keep the same folder structure. If all you are doing is extracting resources, it really doesn't matter if you're choosing yes or no. I take it if you're building mods to be brought back into the game, it might matter. I haven't done that yet, so I can't say for sure. For this example, we're going to hit yes, and in the next example, I'll hit no, and we'll see what the difference is. So it's going to tell you that your file is successfully copied to the Baldur's Gate data mods, our mod folder here, and then this is that data path that it's talking about. This item lives in this path for the game, in shared assets, weapons, resources, and then finally the folder. So this is just the structure of the game path, and so because we told it to follow that structure, it's going to make sure that the mod is following the same structure. So now I'm in our mod folder, and we're going to follow that path that it created. So data, public, shared, assets, weapons, resources, and we have our gr2 file. So let's see about getting it into Blender. All right, I'm in Blender here. I'm going to clean up our scene and move our default cube to a safe space. And let's import our hammer. So again, make sure that your divine path is set up here, or else you're going to get an error. And we're going to go to File, Import, DOS2 BG3 Collada. Now you can choose to copy the GR2 out of your mod folder. That's not necessary. I'm just going to go right into our same mod folder here and select our item and hit import. And we'll see that it imports with an armature here as well as all of the level of detail meshes. Now, one thing that you might not notice at first with a model like this, but you will see with other models, is that everything comes into Blender flipped. And so what I mean by that is with our default view here, the hammer head is pointed down the y-axis. But when we're looking at things in the mod toolkit, the hammer is pointed towards us on the y-axis. Now for models like this, it really doesn't matter, but here are some instances where it might matter a little bit. So for instance, in this file, I was extracting some decor and furniture, and every time I imported something, they would come in facing the wrong way. Now you can choose to do all of your work from this side, but then when you hit 1, your front view is actually going to be the back view. You can of course hit Control 1 to then see your back view instead. But I like to just get things aligned by either rotating 180 on the z-axis, or you could even scale on the y-axis -1 to flip these around here. Either method is perfectly valid, but there is one thing to note about how the textures will project onto the models. Again, it's pretty much irrelevant for models like this where you're not going to notice, but for models like characters you might choose to scale instead of flip, and here's why. So having a look at my Tav again here that I have extracted, we can see that her tattoos are on our right, her left, but looking at the image texture here, we can see that it's actually flipped. Now, when I imported her, I chose the rotation method, so that's why the textures show up as flipped. So if you're doing characters where it might be more intuitive to have both the texture and the render view here look the same, then you might want to do the flip method instead of the rotate method. So just something to be aware of, but again, either thing works. I even went down a whole rabbit hole thinking that, oh, is this going to somehow mess up my normal textures because it should actually be flipped and they're pointing inwards or outwards or what? And long story short, it's fine. Either method works. It'll show up just fine. Just an FYI in case you ever get confused as to why the textures are flipped between the model and the texture itself. Alright, so we got our model here. Depending on what it is that you need to do with the model, you may choose to keep the armature and the level of details around. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and delete all of them. And just as an FYI, when you import it, you're going to see this rotation of 90 degrees on the x-axis. And because we were just talking about everything, I'm just going to go ahead and scale y -1 and apply the rotation and scale. I'm just going to do all because there's no location. Not that any of that matters for this model in particular. Another thing to note is you'll notice some weird shading on it. You can go to Shade Smooth, which is obviously not the right choice for this type of an object. Shade Flat to see the polygons, or Auto Smooth, which will be right for something like this. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the weird shading is coming from, if you go to the Object Data tab here, it's coming from the custom split normals. This is definitely outside of my area of expertise. So if you know more about this, please definitely leave a comment below and explain to us, if this is something that we should clear or get rid of. or if it's something that we should keep around. Just as an FYI, on my tab, I had cleared mine completely with all of the edits that I was doing to get that model up and running in Blender. Again, I'm not sure if that custom normal data is something that you're going to want to keep around and for what use cases. So just something to be aware of. All right, and now that we have our model in here, let's see about getting those textures. Okay, so we're back in the Mod Toolkit here. We have our Warhammer selected. What I like to do to find textures is we're going to go on the visual resource and we're going to list dependencies for this resource. And that will prompt a message down here in the message log and says that this Warhammer is using all of the following resources. It's using a material resource named Weapon Human Warhammer A1, and it has this unique identifier. I like to copy that into my notes document, but when you hit copy to clipboard, it's going to copy everything that's in here. So I'm going to go ahead and clear, list dependencies, and if you do copy to clipboard and go into your notes, it will copy everything. Sometimes we might not want that, especially if it's throwing a bunch of these random errors at us. Other models will have many different resources and textures, so you might just want to copy the whole batch at once. But I'm going to undo that. To copy a single thing here, you can't actually copy the top here, but if you click on a message, it'll open it up down here, and we can actually go ahead, and it's kind of hard to select. It's really finicky. You can go ahead and copy this whole line. Okay, it looks like the screen recording was a little bit glitchy here, but it let me select the whole line and copy the material resource that this weapon is using. So for the sake of example, I'm going to copy our global unique identifier up here, go ahead and paste it, even though it was already in the list up there. But now we have our material resource with that GUID, and the way it loads in here is going to be on a sphere. You can do it on a cube or a cylinder. I often like to look at things on the plane because this just mimics looking at it on like the standard image texture. But this is a material. Whoops. This is a material. You can see the reflections are going and everything. Here in the options, you also have the option to include some of the ambient occlusion. I don't think we're going to see much of a difference there. I guess shadows. I don't see a difference, but bloom here, we'll see that it's now rendering the bloom. Just another thing to note about the material resources, you can go ahead and open them. It's going to open this little panel here. We have a material type, metal. We can see the texture map that it's referencing. And this panel will be more important for people who are doing like texture or material mods for modding in-game. But for the sake of just extracting the models and textures, we don't need to worry about this page. Although sometimes you might see other attributes listed in here for things like skin color and armor color. But again, nothing for this model because this is our most basic example here. So once we find our material, what we're going to go ahead and do is list the dependencies again. And we can see that this material is referencing a texture resource and a virtual texture resource. So I'm going to go ahead and copy both of these to my notes document. So now we're keeping good track of things. We have our mesh up here, what material it's using, and what textures make up that material. Now, having extracted as many things as I have, whenever you see this ref cloud type of textures, we're not going to need that. That's going to be a tileable noise texture. So let's have a look at it here. So if we click on ref cloud B, it's just this noise. so we're not going to need it. I'm not 100% sure what these are used for, but they're on a lot of objects. I think this might be for when there's like different special effects in the game, like when things catch fire and whatever, when you inevitably fireball the heck out of everybody. But I could be wrong, so I'm not entirely sure. But what I do know is you pretty much never need these to texture your things in Blender. So let's have a look at our virtual texture resource. So I'm just going to look it up by name this time, and we can see our virtual texture resource. And what a virtual texture resource is, from my understanding, is it is several textures packed into one single file that's more machine readable, as opposed to having 3 individual images that the game needs to load. So in our preview window here, again, the right click and drag is to zoom in and out, and middle mouse will pan around. We can see that the 3 texture maps that will make up pretty much every virtual texture resource are going to have the albedo or base color here, we'll have the normal here, and then we'll have what is a physical map, and the red, green, and blue channels, and alpha channel sometimes in this map will be various things like the metallic, the roughness, and ambient occlusion. So one thing that we need to check before we extract these is we need to check the alpha. By default, it's set to off. And if we turn it on in this case, we see that nothing happens, which is a good sign. We're also not expecting there to be an alpha on this kind of a model. There's no transparent places on it, but it's always good to check. If we go to only, we see pure white here, and so when we see pure white, we know that we're good to go on extracting this virtual texture resource right here in the mod toolkit, because there's no alpha channel to worry about. This is something that we'll have a look at once we get to our next more advanced example. But when we see that there's no alpha channel here, we know that we're good to go. And we'll cover the overlay in the next example. So it doesn't matter what option you have currently selected here. To extract a visual texture resource, we go ahead and right-click it and say Extract Virtual Texture Data. It's going to prompt a window and a file path to where you would like to extract it. You can set this to anything, however, it will reset to the same exact file path for every single time you want to extract a virtual texture resource. So instead of wasting a bunch of time navigating in a window to a project folder and whatever, I'm just going to have that extract to the default file path, which is going to be our Baldur's Gate data, mods, and our mod folder that we're currently in, and the data folder within that mod folder. So I'm just going to hit extract, and it's going to give us a confirmation that it extracted to that directory. So we're here in our mods folder here, and we'll go into data, and now we have our albedo, normal, and physical maps. For working with textures, I definitely like to copy those out of the mod folder. So I have my Blender project folder going here, and I'm going to paste that into a folder called maps. One quick tip is if you type in the file browser here a // that will jump you to wherever this Blender file lives. So we have our 3 textures here, the albedo, normal, and physical, but you might notice that the normal and physical maps look a little bit weird. The normal map is completely transparent, and the physical map has this weird half transparency on it. No worries, all of the data that we'll need is actually in here. Hey, future me here. I forgot to note something about using DDS files in Blender. By technicality, DDS files are not supported in Blender. You can find various resources telling you this and telling you that DDS files can lead to render errors. However, nobody has shown what sort of render errors actually occur if you use DDS files in Blender. So that's a little bit odd. But it's just something to note that in case you end up with any render errors and you are using DDS files, that might be the problem. That being said, there's a few things that you can and should do. You can either choose to immediately convert all of your DDS files into other formats like PNG or TGA before you get to work in Blender. That's where you can use programs like GIMP or DDS Clobber to convert these files. I've actually noticed that if you open up a DDS file in Blender's image editor, you can just go to Image Save As, and you can save it as any format that you want. So if I just have like 1 or 2 files that I need to convert really quickly, I'll just do that. If you're building out more complicated materials, sometimes I'll like to just work with the DDS files right here in Blender and then convert later. If you do that, you will need to run a script to tell Blender to switch all of the material references, to switch the DDS to the whatever new version you made, whether it's PNG, TGA, whatever. Other times you might choose to bake the image textures out completely. So you have a lot of options. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to toss the DDS files straight into Blender because they're going to display just fine here for the sake of the tutorial. But be sure to check out the link in the description for a more in-depth discussion on that. So I'll bring in the albedo. This can be set to sRGB. We'll plug that in. I'll bring in the physical map here. This will need to be set to non-color. And then we're going to separate RGB. And now we can cycle through all of the different channels that we have here. So these physical maps, the way that they are packed is the red is going to be your metallic, the green is roughness, blue is ambient occlusion. We can see those little shadowy details in the crevices there. And for this model and textures, the alpha is just this going to be a medium gray color. What the alpha would be if we were expecting one is a velvet mask. So this is going to be for things like tintable armor. Some furniture items might have a velvet mask. So if your object has velvet on it, that's when you'll need to look at the alpha channel. Again, we're going to cover that in the next example. For this, we're not expecting one and we don't need it. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in red to metallic, green into roughness. And that's looking pretty good here. And then to blend the ambient occlusion, I'm going to use a mix node here. Have the base color go into the A socket, the ambient occlusion into B. Can go ahead and preview that, set the factor to 100, set that to multiply, and now looking at what's going to be our base color here. And if I toggle that on and off, you can see that we're getting some good details into there. So I'm going to send that into the base color and have a look at our full material here. And we can move on to the normal. So when we bring the normal in here, this also needs to be set to non-color. When we preview it, this is actually a DirectX normal. So if I bring it back up in here, if I go to color and alpha, again, it's completely transparent. That is just because the alpha channel is pure black. If I go to color, we can see that the normal data is properly there. We can cycle through the red, the green, and blue. I'll just set that to color. Again, the game uses DirectX normals, so what we need to do for Blender is flip the green channel because Blender uses OpenGL normals. Now, to do that manually, you'll go to separate color, take the green, can invert the color for that. We'll go to combine color. Red goes to red, blue goes to blue. Gonna move all of this over. Now we can send this to a normal map. And so if we preview our flip here, we're flipping the green channel, and then we can plug our normal map in, and there we go. We have our textured object. Now, if you do this enough times, this is really tedious. So instead of having to do that over and over again, I have a normal flip node in my assets. So I have this DirectX OpenGL switch in my asset library. It's going to drag and drop that on, and it does the exact same thing. It flips the green channel just to switch back and forth between DirectX and OpenGL normals. So for most basic items in the game, this is the only node setup that you're going to need. You'll have the albedo, the physical for your metallic roughness and ambient occlusion, and then your normal map, which you'll just switch to OpenGL by flipping the green channel, and that's it. So you could even make a node group here for like a general Baldur's Gate to Blender node setup, and that will cover you in most cases. However, things will get a little bit more complicated once we have objects with alphas and velvet maps. If your object has an alpha, you're just going to plug in the alpha to the alpha, so that's really straightforward. Okay, so let's have a look at extracting and texturing our market tarp here. For this example, we're going to be leveling up in complexity in two ways. The first way is we're going to need a texture resource in addition to the virtual texture resource set. Also, our virtual textures will now have an alpha. So we're going to see what differences in the workflow there will be for extracting those. All right, to get started here, I'm going to do my copy name and GUID to my notes to keep track. And now we need to figure out what material this uses. So we go ahead and right-click List Dependencies for this resource, and we can see that it's using the material Decorations General Market Tarp B. And you'll notice in this case that is not the same name as the object that we're extracting. So what's happening here is a lot of these market tarps are going to be using the same material here. So I'm going to get my material name, copy that to my notes, and now we're going to find out what textures this material uses. It's already up here. We have DecGen Market Tarp B, which is indeed the correct one, DecGen Market Tarp B. We can see our little preview here, which has a little animation on it for the wind. And once again, we're going to come over List Dependencies, and we see that we have a bunch more resources here. So this tileable noise cloud, again, we're not going to need that. We have another ref cloud B, not going to need that again. We are going to need the texture resource here. It looks like we have an ID mask file, and then we have our virtual texture set. So I'm going to go ahead and copy those over to my notes. And again, we have an interesting little tidbit here. We have DecGen Market Tarp A being used in the DecGen Market Tarp B material. So as expected, we have a lot of reused materials and textures here. So because our virtual textures and our texture resource share the same name, I'm going to copy the name here And we have our virtual texture resource. And remember what we always do, we always check the alpha here. So if we set alpha to off and then set it to on, we can see that some stuff changes in our albedo map here. So we do have transparent areas. Similarly, if we set it to alpha only, now we are only viewing our alpha channel, and we can see that there are indeed going to be transparent areas here. If we set it to overlay, that's just going to overlay the alpha channel as like a red mask. So anywhere there isn't red, which is only these little crevices here, you can identify whether or not you have an alpha channel by setting it to overlay as well. So because we have an alpha channel, this indicates to us that we're going to need to use the old Baldur's Gate 3 Modders Multi-Tool to be able to extract those alpha channels. So even though we're going to need to use the Modders Multi-Tool in order to get that alpha channel out, I'm still going to extract virtual texture data. Again, it defaults on our mod folder and the data subfolder, so I'll hit extract. And then I'm going to copy those over into my project folder. And in order to get at the alpha channel, which will be missing from the extraction that we just did, I do already have a more in-depth video talking about how to do that. So definitely check that out, but the gist of it is going to be this. We're going to go back to our virtual texture resource here in the mod toolkit, and we're going to come down to this attribute called gtext file name. We're going to go ahead and right click that row, and we're going to copy the value to the clipboard. The name here, the property name, if you just hit that, you're just going to get gtext file name in your clipboard. If you copy the value, everything in this column are the values. You're going to get this serial number in your clipboard. So with that copied, I'm going to come back to my notes here and say that the gtext is this serial name. So let's open up the Modders Multi-Tool here. We're going to go search the index. And now we are going to paste that gtext file name in the multi-tool and go ahead and search. Now it brings up an LSF and a GTP file. We're going to click on the GTP file, and then we're going to come over here to extract file. And it'll tell us down here that it has extracted that. You can go ahead and hit open folder and it'll immediately take you to where that was extracted. And there's a bazillion files in here, so we're going to paste the gtext file name again, and now you'll see that you have the albedo normal physical maps all extracted, and the _0 is your albedo, _1 is going to be your normal map, but we can already see that looks different than the normal maps that we're used to, and the _2 is going to be our physical map. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of these into my Blender project folder. Okay, so we have our albedo normal physical set extracted from the new mod toolkit. We also have the same set extracted from the old Modders Multi-Tool, and in a minute here we'll have a look at the differences in Blender. But before we get there, we have one more texture to extract. So if you remember here, we're done extracting our virtual textures for the market tarp, but we also need the ID mask, which is a texture resource, which is extracted a little bit differently from the mod toolkit. So here's our ID mask. I can set alpha to off. Doesn't really matter what we're looking at here. But if we right click on a texture resource, we don't have any option to just extract that. So the way that we actually get at this kind of a file is we go down to override in the active mod. Are you sure you want to override? Yes. It's going to ask you the same thing if you want to keep the same package structure. I'm going to hit no in this case, and then we can just hit OK here. And once that file is overwritten in the active mod, you'll see an _00 at the end of it, so you'll know that it's finished there. And to see where that overwritten file ended up, we can actually see the file path down here. You can choose to copy and paste this up here, because this window here is actually prompting you to select a file. We don't want to accidentally select a different file. So you can either copy paste this or navigate there manually. So if you remember, most of our mod stuff has been going into Baldur's Gate 3, data, mods, and our tutorial here. Most of our data has been going into here, but that ID mask actually wound up in a different directory. So we're going to go back up to the data subfolder within Baldur's Gate 3. We're going to go into generated, public, our tutorial mod, and then assets, decoration, generic, the market tarp here, resources, and there's our ID mask. So I'm going to once again copy this into my Blender project folder. And I actually haven't extracted our mesh here, so I'm going to go ahead and paste the name, confirm that this is the mesh that I want, right click and extract visual data. For this, I'm going to say no for keeping the same folder structure. And in this case, you can see that it's in our mods tutorial folder, and it's just right within the folder. So back in our main mods folder here, which again is in Baldur's Gate data, mods, then your mod name and data here, we can see that's where our GR2 mesh extracts to if we don't have it replicate the overall structure. So that can be convenient if you just want to pile all of the files into here. All right, so getting back into Blender here, we're going to go to Import, BG3, going to navigate to our GR2 file, Import, and once again, it comes in flipped around. I'll go ahead and hide Ketheric's hammer, go ahead and delete the armature and level of detail for the sake of this tutorial. And for this one, I'll just do the rotate instead of the scale. Again, it really doesn't matter for these types of objects. And if we want, we can clear out the rotation. All right, now let's hop over to our shading tab. All right, I'm gonna make a new material for this. I think it's actually best practice to just name the material the same thing that we have in the resource manager. You can either do the full name or sometimes just get rid of the prefix for like decorations general or decor general. I don't know if it's decorations or decor, but any which way, you can name our material here. Now let's bring in the maps that we extracted from the new mod toolkit. So those are going to be the ones that end with the underscore albedo, normal, and physical. So if I plug in the base color here, we can see that we get a solid base color. But if we switch over to the alpha, we are now missing an alpha channel. So there's no way that we can get our transparency on the model here. And this alpha channel, as we saw in the mod toolkit, is supposed to be packed into the albedo. It's not going to be packed into the physical or the normal maps. So as a comparison, let's look at the albedo, which is going to be the _0 that came out of the old Modders multi-tool. If we look at color, we can see that the color is the same, although we're actually getting some black where the alpha channel would be. And if we look at the alpha channel, we get our proper alpha. So you can choose to plug in this base color and this alpha if you want, and that'll look right. You can choose to keep the other one around and do that base color. It's all the same. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the one that came out of the new mod toolkit for the sake of simplicity. Alright, before we get too far along here, I want to showcase the differences of what happens to the channel packing when we extract textures through the new mod toolkit and the old Modders multi-tool. So up top I have the physical map extracted from the old Modders multi-tool, so that's going to be the one that ends in an _2. And then on the bottom here I have what's extracted from the new mod toolkit. For the physical maps, it doesn't matter which you pick in instances like this. Your red, green, and blue channels all are going to be exactly the same. So this is going to be your metallic, your roughness, and your ambient occlusion. Remember, the alpha channel is going to be for things like velvet. We're not expecting a velvet mask here, so the alpha channel doesn't matter for us. But what comes out of the new mod toolkit happens to have a gray texture here for the alpha channel, so it gives the RGBA view a little bit of transparency. Again, it doesn't matter because we're only going to be using the R, G, and B channels. Where there is going to be a notable difference in the channel packing is actually going to be in the normal map. So once again, on top I have the normal map from the old Modders multi-tool. That's going to be the _1. And then on the bottom here I have the normal from the new mod toolkit. As we can see, again, this is completely transparent, and that's because our alpha channel is completely black. For the Modders multi-tool version, we get this very blue-looking normal map, and it's kind of semi-transparent in a weird way, and that's because the channels are packed differently. We have a green channel, which the greens are actually the same as each other. We have a blue channel, and we notice that the blues are actually the same as each other. But what happened here is the red channel and the alpha channel are actually just switched. So we have our red in the red channel for the mod toolkit version, and in the Modders multi-tool version, we have the red in the alpha channel as well. So both of these contain the same data, but they are just in different channels. So let's get back to building out our material here. I have both of the physical versions here, which, as we saw, is all the same. So go ahead and separate RGB. Red is going to be our metallic, green is going to be our roughness, and blue is our ambient occlusion, so that's going to get mixed in to the base color. And so now the normal map. It doesn't matter which one we use because, as we saw, they both contain the same data, they're just packed into different channels. So for the sake of example, let's use what comes out of the old mod toolkit. So we're going to separate color. We are going to need to invert the green node again. And then for the combine color, if you remember, our alpha channel is actually our red channel. The green needs to be flipped again because it's a DirectX to OpenGL. And then our blue is still in the blue channel. So now we have our normal map looking correct. So we can add our normal map node and plug it into our shader. And also, just for the sake of example, I'm going to bring up the mod toolkit version of the normal, drop my DirectX to OpenGL switch on it, and just go ahead and preview that. And we can look at the color of just flipping the green channel on this versus switching around the channels here and again flipping the green channel. And you can see that we have the exact same normal going on. So I'm going to go back to our material here, get rid of that, which we don't need. So one thing that you might notice here is we haven't used our ID mask yet, and you might have noticed that our market tarp is actually missing the little details on the side of it here. So if we switch back to the Mod Toolkit and zoom in a whole bunch here, we can see that there's a bunch of little details across the tarp. So I'll come back to Blender here, and now I'm going to bring in our ID mask. This needs to be set to non-color. Again, everything is non-color except for the albedo map. And for the ID mask, we're going to separate color again, and let's have a look at what we have here. So for the red, it looks like it selects mostly the upper tarp. Everything else is mostly black, although we do get a little bit of shading here. If we go to green, it seems like we have no green at all, so this is probably just a completely unused channel. If we go to blue, we can see that selects our little details on the side here. And if we go to alpha, there is nothing in the alpha. By the way, the whole texture fiasco of the missing alphas, that only applies to virtual textures. When you have just texture resources, those will extract perfectly fine in the new Mod Toolkit. You don't need to go hunting down the same files through the old multi-tool, and you don't have to deal with any of that. Okay, so let's see about getting our little details on the side here. For something as simple as this, we can just do that with some mix nodes and color ramps. So here I just have our base color with the ambient occlusion mixed in. It doesn't really matter what order we do this in. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that, put this color into the A slot, go ahead and preview this, set it all the way to A, and then for B, let's say that I want those little details to be completely black. So we're going to say I want pure black to show up, and I'm going to use the blue channel as the factor for where I want pure black to show up. So we put that into the factor, and now we got our little details. It doesn't quite look right, so we can just add a color ramp in between, and we want more of that to show up, so we can just bring that right slider over a little bit and get more black to show up. We could just totally change the color of this if we wanted. If we wanted, say, you know, like a deep blue or something, we can do that. Or set it to like a red or an orange here. So this is where the artistry comes in of how to colorize your materials with the assets that you have available to you. So then we're going to take our new base color here, put that in the base color, and now in our final material we have our alpha working, and we got those little painted on details back. So whenever you get something with an ID mask, you can use the masks that are available to you for colorizing certain things. So when I had extracted this resource for Shadowheart's camp, I did a little bit more work and effort to get the pole and the tarp colors and materials looking a little bit better here. But again, that's just going to be mixing in different things into pretty much just the base color to get it looking right. But I'd save that for this example. I'm just going to leave it here for now. All right, and probably the moment that a lot of you have been waiting for, and that is how to extract and texture characters and their customizable clothing. To be honest, this is a huge topic for Baldur's Gate, but the good news is extracting the models and the texture files is the exact same process. You find the meshes, you right-click them, you say extract visual data, and then you find the textures and the virtual textures. You extract those in the ways that we've covered in this video, and it's all the same. However, once it comes to developing materials inside of something like Blender, that's when things get really complicated. And that's honestly deserving of an entire video series in and of itself to give that its proper time. Nonetheless, I still wanted to at least touch on it so you can get started with it, and there's a lot of resources out there to help you figure out how to make sense of those materials and those textures. And again, I would highly, highly recommend using Volno's texture toolbox in order to make sense of those textures. But let's real quickly touch on finding character models within the mod toolkit. So back in the toolkit, we have an asset type here called a character visual. And if I solo that, we can see characters. So let's just say we wanted to get at Gale, and we have a few different versions of Gale. Oh, don't want to show that one. That one's a naked Gale. Anyways, clicking through here, you can preview the character that each one will load. One thing that's kind of nice is if you hit the option and uncheck fit camera, you can actually scroll through all of these. Meanwhile, half of these Gales are naked, so that's fun. But that just prevents it from having the screen reset every single time. So if I go back to fit camera, do another one, yeah, you'll see that if I zoom in here, and then every time I click on a character visual, it resets. So that can be convenient for previewing like some of the head models and stuff like that. But anyways, so we have this Gale, and this is a character visual resource. Basically, this is just a collection of meshes and materials and some other things that make up the entity that is Gale. So just like with everything else, what we're going to do is we're going to list dependencies for this resource. And you'll see here that when we're dealing with characters, we have a lot of resources. We have like half a dozen different visual resources here. We have like 4 or 5 different materials here. So yeah, there's a lot, and that's why we're not going to cover everything in this video. But the process, again, is the same. And this is why I like to keep a notes application going. I would copy all of the visual resources and all of the materials to my notes. I would go ahead and extract every single visual resource, so every single mesh file for it. Figure out what every single mesh, what material they're using, extract all of those. So, you know, it's all the same. Another thing to note is that some of the more unique characters, so most of your origin type characters and some of the other more prominent NPCs, they're going to have their own unique meshes, materials, and textures for pretty much everything. However, a lot of the NPCs will actually share some, if not all, of their resources with other NPCs. So for instance, if I look up Minthara, and we can see we have an armored Minthara here. And if we go to list the dependencies for Minthara, we can see that, for example, the body that she uses is actually just a human body. And so this is going to be true for pretty much all of the humanoid characters, whether they're drow, elf, half-elf, whatever. They're going to just be using the human meshes and textures for a lot of the races that you have there. So for something like an elf, you'll need to pay attention to what head gets referenced, because they're going to have the pointy ears. Things like tieflings and dragonborn, they're going to have their own bodies totally. Another interesting thing about tieflings, they're a humanoid type character, but they do have their own bodies because they have the horns and the tail and the little tiefling protrusion details. But for the clothing, they're actually just using the same human clothing that all of the other humanoids will use. Even though they have their tail is actually just going to clip through any of the clothing that they have on. But interestingly, for the underwear, the tieflings do get their own underwear models. So for instance, if we were looking for Astarion's camp clothes, we could do Astarion pants, if I can spell. Oh, I'm in the character visuals. So if I go to the visual resource, we can see here that we have Dragonborn, Dwarf, Gnome, GTY must be Githyanki. We got our halflings, half-orcs, and humans, but no tieflings, because again, tieflings will be wearing the human version. So of course, this is, again, it's a video game and there's a lot of asset sharing going on here. But again, the process will be the same. You'll find whatever mesh or visual resource that you need. You'll find whatever material that gets assigned to it, and then whatever textures go into that material. So for instance, if I do a quick search here for Tiff Head, we're going to get a bunch of the head models here. You'll have them for male, female. You'll also have the child models. You'll also have the versions for the strong characters. So you have female strong and male strong. And so those will be abbreviated with MS and FS respectively. So for instance, I know that my Tiefling tab is using the Tiefling female head B. And then if I wanted to preview the other heads, I'm going to uncheck fit camera so that it doesn't bounce around. And then we can have a look at all of the different heads that we have available. And then, for example, we're looking at female head E. If we go look at the female strong head E, you can see that it is higher because it's going to be on the larger body for the strong version. But going back to head B, we're going to list dependencies. We're going to see that it's using a ton of different materials. One thing to note is that the heads come with the eyes and the teeth and the tongue and like everything on the inside of the mouth. So that's super convenient. It's all just packaged together. You even have different level of details for the materials. So not just mesh level of details, but material level of details. But we can see that the main material here is the Tiefling Head B material. So if I go ahead and solo my materials here and find Tiefling Head B, go ahead and fit the camera on this one. We can see, we can see a preview of the material that we have. And once again, list the dependencies. But in this case, you'll see that there are just about a dozen different textures that get mapped into here, and that is why we're not going to be looking at this today. If you're going to get into it, you would go ahead and extract all of these. Looks like they're all texture resources, so no virtual textures in this case. And then I would recommend downloading Volno's Texture Toolbox. It's available on Nexus Mods. And once you open that up, you'll have a bunch of different material presets to basically just plug and play all of those different textures. So if I have a look at the head here, there's a big old node group here, and you'll basically just, you might have to replace some or all of these. Some of these get used for all of the characters, so you won't need to replace those. But then you'll plug them into the shader, and then you can use, he's made a ton of different presets here, which is really great for getting going super quick. One thing to note about any of the textures that you plug into here, whether it's for the head, the body, the armor, anything, is this normal format toggle. By default, it is expecting the version of the normal that you're getting out of the old Baldur's Gate 3 Modders multi-tool. That's when Volno's Toolbox was developed. But now that the new mod toolkit packs the channels differently, you might have different channel packing. So doing this toggle will toggle between either expected format. So if the normals are looking something weird, like something weird is going on, try toggling it to see if that solves the issue. Otherwise, I recommend looking at every single channel of your normal map individually and seeing what the heck is going on there. So for the velvet masks, things like Astarion's shirt have a velvet mask here where you can see that as you move the camera around, you kind of get that velvety sheen as the color changes here. So if I have a look at that, if I turn off the velvet, we just get the base color and we don't get that kind of interesting effect there. So again, as you're extracting your resources, just double check and ask yourself, do I expect to see any kind of a velvet effect on this item? And that will determine if you need to worry about the alpha channel in the physical map. As a side note, it's super cool how the velvet actually works if you dig into the nodes there. It's pretty interesting. But that's perhaps a discussion for another day. One great thing about Volno's texture toolbox is in some of the more recent updates, he's turned this into an asset library, so you can really quickly append these materials into new projects. So yeah, definitely check it out if you get into texturing the more complicated models that are found in Baldur's Gate 3. Be sure to check for updates with the toolbox because the author is constantly making improvements and fixes with it. The amount of effort that went into figuring out the shaders is yeah, that's a lot. So yeah, really awesome work by the author to put this out for us. And the toolbox is how I textured my Tav almost completely, including the clothing. Some other things like the hair and the eyes I just did myself. I was able to recreate the manual work that I did in the toolbox really quickly. So yeah, can't recommend it enough. Another thing to note is you can totally just leave this big node group in here and work like that in Blender, or you can choose to texture bake out all of the different PBR maps like the diffuse, metallic, normal, etc., which is what I chose to do for my Tav, but either works. One thing that I'd also like to point out is sometimes characters aren't named what you would think they'd be named. For instance, if I search for Alfira, you'll actually see that I don't get a character visual called Alfira, but we do get some virtual texture resources and visual resources for some of Alfira's items, but we don't get Alfira herself. There's a lot of ways that we can go about hunting down where Alfira is. One of the other great features about the mod toolkit is the inverse of listing dependencies, and that's finding references. So that finds anything that refers to this resource. So Alfira is obviously going to be wearing Alfira's skirt. So if we find the references, it'll tell us what resources are going to use Alfira's skirt. And it looks like we have two resources, both with the name of Denbard. And if we go ahead and search for that, we get Alfira. So there she is. So yeah, finding the assets in the resource manager can sometimes be a trip. Things aren't always named what you'd think they'd be. Other times they're just sharing assets with another similar model. You'll need to use a lot of context clues. Sometimes you can hunt around levels and find spawn points for what characters and what items spawn where. So yeah, it's just a lot of detective work sometimes when you get some tricky to find models. So yeah, all in all, extracting the meshes and the textures is pretty straightforward. It's just recreating the materials in an external program where it gets really complicated. So all of your meshes, aka visual resources, you're just going to right-click and extract visual data. All of your texture resources, you're just going to override in the active mod. For virtual textures, you're just going to extract virtual texture data, but you're also going to check if there's either an alpha map or a velvet map expected. More complex materials will use ID masks and all sorts of other masks, and if you get into the much more complicated stuff like characters and tintable armor, definitely have a look at Volno's texture toolbox. So that about wraps it up for this tutorial. I know it was a lot, but it should get you started with how to extract textured models using the new Larian Mod Toolkit. If you found this video useful, definitely give it a thumbs up and feel free to subscribe. And let me know in the comments below if it would be helpful to maybe make a video series on extracting characters and go through the whole process of extracting those character meshes and building out the materials in Blender. So let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. And again, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.